Anderlugen Saga, or Vinland Saga. This is the actual winner of the manga poll, and the reason it's taken a little bit longer than Chainsaw Man is I'm planning to make these videos a volume each. And before you even comment it, you little stinker, Daniel, your bookmark's only at the halfway point. What are you doing? Well, I actually want to do these while they're still fresh in my head, and if I went through and did the entire Vinland Saga Volume 1 before doing this video, I would probably start forgetting some pretty important things. So you might notice an outfit change halfway through the video. That is where I left off, finished reading, and came back, which for you, I could make a seamless change, but I have just decided not to. Why not? I don't know. And one last note before we go ahead and just get on into it. This is a spoiler-filled read-along of Vinland Saga. What that basically means is I'm actually going to be going beat by beat through the story to have a discussion with you, the audience, that is more like a book club than anything else I have ever done here on the channel. And I want to just say thank you to everyone who has decided to jump on board these read-alongs. It's the closest thing to story time I've ever gotten with my audience. Maybe I should start calling them story times. Would that do better in the algorithm? You vote down below. I'll have a poll link. Should they be called read-alongs or story times? Berserk story times sounds a little, I don't know, odd. But without any further ado, let us jump into Vinland Saga. Chapter 1. Vinland Saga decides to kick on off with a siege immediately, and we are seeing two, at first, unnamed forces battle it out as archers rain hail from above down on a battering ram. When the crossbows come out, the attacking army does a full-on retreat, and then we cut to a third party watching down from the heights and essentially saying, we can offer to help the attackers and win the battle for them, and we'll demand half the treasury in response as payment. And we're going to send our young lad Thorfinn here to go and negotiate with the attackers. And enter our protagonist. Thorfinn steps forward and he is offered 3 gold coins for his messenger services, but says, no, you know the payment I want, to which the leader Askland agrees. I don't think I said that right, but it's me, you should expect that. And the morality of this third party is also fleshed out with them being like, hey, if the attackers turn us down, we'll fight for the defenders. They're not exactly men of creed, or at least not a creed of like we're loyal to one. They're mercenaries. It's a mercenary group. Thorfinn, though, goes to the attacker camp, and well, at first he has a bit of a scruffle with the guards due to the fact of them not speaking the same language, which is a detail I really appreciate. The fact that we also get subtitled text with the speech bubbles, very cool, nice immersive touch. But he easily incapacitates the guards and asks for someone who speaks his language. That is given to him, and he speaks with a noble, essentially offering what services the mercenaries may have. The noble, as soon as Thorfinn's out of the earshot, says like, we'll probably betray these people we're hiring and not give them the share of their promise, but whatever, we'll use them for the attack. Thorfinn then sends off a signal letting them know that, hey, the agreement's been had, and we see the defenders note the signal, and this is actually something that's kind of like a dropped plot point. They're like, oh, we'll prepare for whatever they're trying to signal for a secondary group, but they don't at all. And finally, we see some great effort is being done by our mercenary band, but the exact details of it remain unclear to us, though we see some of the attackers' men notice a dragon's head that looks suspiciously like a ship front from Vikings cresting over a mountain. We see in the next day the attack resumes, and it's not going very well. It's essentially a repeat of the strategy from the day before, and so the archers are just raining hell down on these attackers, trying to bring a measly battering ram against the gate. Part of the deal, though, is Thorfinn must bring the defending commander's head, and so while this attack is ongoing, he sprints off towards the fortress after being told which one on the wall is the captain. He's got some feathery guys. Note to anyone who's in command actually in the military who happens to be watching this, don't put giant plume feathers in your helmet, or a small Viking boy might come and cut your head off. But just as this lord is saying, oh, Thorfinn's run off, these attackers are not on our side, we're being had, this is ridiculous, we're the superior force, we should be winning, there's a commotion in the woods behind him, and we see our mercenary band burst from the woods, carrying their ships on their shoulders and running them into the lake behind the fortress, because due to some rapids, they couldn't actually take the normal lake down, so they carried them over. That's probably a CrossFit routine at some point. carry Viking ships. I did CrossFit for a while. I absolutely could see them recommending that. But we see the defenders are like, oh, shyster, we didn't plan for this at all, despite seeing that flare the night before and saying we should probably have some kind of reserve in case a surprise attack came. Drat, let's go take the crossbowmen we saw so effective from the day before, I like that detail, and try and intercept these ships and do so much damage they don't really have a threat to us. So we see this commander runs off with his archers and begins to pursue the line of ships along the wall. An actually pretty damn well laid out siege for how quickly it's being set up. And just as these crossbowmen set up and begin unleashing hell on the ships that are attacking, Thorfinn leaps on over the wall after climbing up with his little daggers and begins attacking them, distracting the crossbowmen so much that the mercenary band is able to land with not too much damage being done to them. And when Thorfinn actually manages to fight his way to the commander, he easily decapitates him, which causes the commander's head to go over the wall and into the moat. And Thorfinn, without hesitation, knowing he needs to bring the commander's head, leaps off the wall into the moat to go try and pick up the commander's head to have as proof. I don't know how deep moats are, but I personally wouldn't swan dive into one I'm not very familiar with. But with Thorfinn's distraction and the surprise of their attack in general, the mercenaries are able to breach the city while the original attackers haven't even breached the gate yet, taking on a small skeletal force while the bulk of the force is still dealing with the noble attacking at the gate. Once the noble's forces do manage to clear a path into the city, though, they turn and see what skeletal force was sent to deal with the mercenaries has been butchered. And I'd like to point out at this point, the difference between Vinland Saga and Berserk is abundant because, well, Vinland Saga let this be like a you didn't see it, but look how badass this is mystery, or like your imagination fills it in, which is just an approach. It's not inherently better or worse. Berserk would have showed you in detail the absolute butchery that would have occurred from these Vikings coming in and massacring these defenders. Neither is superior, they're just two different approaches to storytelling. It's just really funny to me to just have that direct distinction. In fact, something Kayla pointed out to me that I found really interesting when she was just skimming through this. She hasn't read Vinland Saga. She was like, compared to the Berserk chapters she's looked through with me, she's like, this animation style seems like a halfway point between the really dry and visceral art style of Berserk and the over-the-top cartoonishness of One Piece at times. I think it's obviously far more leaning towards the Berserk end of the spectrum, but she has a point where there is some of the levity brought into the facial expressions that you see on like once in a blue moon rarity within Berserk, but here you see him far more frequently. Although I'm so used to Berserk, when I saw this noble's design, I was like, is he a demon? Oh, no, he's just a noble. There's no demons here. Speaking of, though, that noble comes into the city and he starts speaking about how they're going to betray these mercenaries and, oh, we promised them this payment, but they could actually be an enemy someday. So once we've paid them and they're tired walking off, we're going to... Why is all the treasury gone? And that's because the mercenaries, while the forces were occupied fighting each other, looted the entire town, got back on their ships, and bounced. We see the noble, who has giant yet immaculate teeth, start freaking out, screaming for them to pursue these mercenaries, these thieves, these traitors, when, like, you know, you were gonna betray him too, dude. And I love that we see Askeladd, or whatever the leader of the mercenaries' name is, kind of like waving back to the noble, being like, well, you got the fort, we took all the treasure. Seems about 50-50, that was the deal. Bye! And they also already destroyed almost all the attackers' ships, so they can't necessarily be pursued. And it's like the perfect crime, because you know they never saw the people's faces clearly aside from Thorfinn, and they're just gonna essentially get away with ransacking this place with minimal casualties or effort. Brilliant. I just watched an Ocean's 11 style siege as the opening here. That's fun. And finally, this ends with Thorfinn managing to swim his way back on the boat as the mercenaries are like, he's probably dead. F him, which, wow. And then he says, my payment, I demand it, is a duel with you. Askeladd, I will kill you for what you did to my father. And you're like, wow. Not the dynamic I suspected. Okay. And to his credit, Askeladd, correct me if I'm saying that wrong, or don't, I don't care, says, yes, I agree to this, but we gotta skadoodle first, my guy. Let's skadoodle. And they skadoodle on out of there. And this is where we get a really fun, like, statement piece from Vinland Saga about who exactly we're following. And it says, for roughly 300 years, starting in the 8th century AD, a northern European people terrorized the civilized world in their dragon-headed ships. From Western Europe to Russia, North Africa, Greece, Turkey, even the Middle East. They appeared far and wide without warning, pillaging and slaughtering, only to leave just as suddenly. In Old Frankish, they were the Normanni. In England, they were the Danes. To the Byzantine Empire, they were the Rus or Ross. But in later years, they would simply be known as Vikings. And this is like where it's fascinating to me that this was written by a Japanese author, from what I've been told, and they apparently just did a ton of research into Viking history and culture to craft Vinland Saga. And I love anytime I come across an author who's willing to dedicate themselves to a culture to write something that is really immersive in that way. That's just awesome. And I have a lot of respect for the amount of effort they have to do in terms of just getting the framework for this story correct. Much appreciation. Even if there is some details they get wrong, I just like that level of, like, I don't know, commitment to something. But from here, we cut back to this band of mercenaries returning to their homestead, and we see they are being welcomed as heroes. Women screaming in joy and men saying they want to join the crew. It's a fantastic celebration. Yay! Our pillagers are back. And we see Askeladd is talking to apparently his uncle, who looks very evil. I don't know what else to say about his character design. And his uncle is trying to get the finances in order, but Askeladd just assures him, you're gonna get your payment. Stop worrying. And the uncle's like, say less, fam, that's all I needed to hear. But finally, Askeladd asks the uncle to step forward and act as a witness for his duel with Thorfinn. And there's a really great setup here where the uncle is handling a former noble turned slave, and Askeladd specifically remarks, you're handling her all wrong. It's not the slave's fault that she's been useless in your poor handling. There's a trick to manipulating every human being. And yes, once again, the scans I'm using, same as Chainsaw Man, have slightly different dialogue than the actual physical book I'm reading from, so please excuse any and all inconsistencies. And that might be a little bit too blunt as characterization, but this is a story that started off with a siege. I'm kind of expecting that kind of very forthright on the surface characterization, hopefully so that down the road we can have some faster payoff than we would otherwise be able to get. But Thorfinn has his duel with Askeladd, and predictably, Thorfinn is able to showcase some really great abilities here overall. He's fast, definitely able to put Askeladd on his heels, but once he really takes it seriously, Askeladd is able to directly manipulate Thorfinn into getting angry, overcommitting to attack, and pinning him down. And this could be a duel that's settled by death, but Askeladd apparently values Thorfinn too much and just leaves him as a defeated opponent. And there's some pretty nice detail paid to the combat here, where Thorfinn's using 2 knives, so he's trying to get in as close as he can so that he has the advantages of the knives. Due to that, Askeladd is using a lot of like elbows and hands with his sword to make sure he's able to control where the knives are and finally utilize his experience to actually take Thorfinn down. He isn't trying to use the full length of his blade when Thorfinn's getting in close, he's more just using it as a shielding device before he finally takes Thorfinn down. Really great attention to detail there. We get the details where one of the villagers comes up to Askeladd later and in a respectful way asks, why do you keep Thorfinn around if he's someone who's so determined to kill you? Is that not dangerous for you? And Askeladd essentially says he has far too much honor to ever try and kill me in my sleep, so I'm not that worried about it. He's a warrior, and he'd rather die than kill me in some kind of dishonorable way. We also at the same time watching this uncle beat the slave for dropping some dishes, which continues the juxtaposition of how one person is controlling someone versus the other. And this is a really great way to set up an antagonist for us. Our protagonist is serving them, just looking for opportunities to take them down, but due to honor, structure, and society, and is unable to actually act out their revenge. And so this narrative is letting us know we're going to be this close with protagonist and at least one of the antagonists. That is a tantalizing setup right there. It's not the first time I've ever seen it, but it's one I enjoy. And throughout this, we've learned that apparently Askeladd killed Thorfinn's father in a fairly dishonorable way in a hostage situation, the details of which I do not know yet. But here we are seeing Thorfinn kind of mourn his loss out on his father's ship, which Askeladd has within his fleet. It's empty, he's just wrapped in a blanket, and the ghost or a visage of his father comes and comforts him for his loss. And it says something about Thorfinn's father's quality of character that even in this vision, he's like the sweetest guy to his kid. The slave girl apparently was instructed to come bring Thorfinn food though, and she shows up, have a conversation that boils down to Thorfinn asking the girl why she doesn't run, but her response boils down to she couldn't kill, which is a very human actual response. Not everyone, even in horrible, dire situations, can bring themselves to kill another individual. I don't know if I could ever bring myself to kill someone unless they were directly threatening the life of someone I know. And that's just adding to the layers of the setup of this character, which is kind of neat. He wouldn't do it, but he understands someone not in the societal structure he's in might be justified in doing so. But another little seed is planted in the story where this former noble, now slave, talks about wanting to go to far distant shores where there are no slaves, no cold, no hunger, etc., etc., a land of peace. And I didn't know that was a big setup until what comes next. America. We see 10 years earlier, and we're seeing a quirky kind of old man smoking a pipe and speaking to a crowd of children. And he speaks of a distant land that is peaceful, warm, and not violent. So, you know, it's kind of the blunt, direct setup that we're talking about here. But again, at the very beginning of mangas, I've realized a lot of them do this, and it is effective if you then use that blunt setup to just springboard off from. And I believe a lot of mangas really want to get going in that way to hook an audience so they can get enough people reading to justify continued printing. So I don't know if I'm right or wrong in saying this. This is me purely speculating in a lot of ways, but I'm assuming that's why I'm seeing this common framework where you just get a lot done to try and then hook people to continue on from. And I don't even mind it that much because a lot of these authors have really utilized that rush setup to have some interesting twists to their story early on. But for those of you who haven't filled in the gaps for what this older man is talking about, he's referencing America because as it has been well documented, it's no longer conspiracy theory, it's actually in history books and stuff. Vikings did come to North America to some extent, and Vinland Saga is playing off of that. This is apparently something I should have already known going into it if I was better educated, because Vinland is the Viking term for that area they apparently encountered in their exploration. It's more of actually the Canadian side of things than like the United States of America, though Canada is technically North America, so it all still applies. But as proof of his journey, he's wearing what looks like a stereotypical Native American headdress and smoking out of a pipe. That's also a clear reference to those cultures. There's some very cute kids not believing him, the old man being upset and trying to convince them it's real by talking to other people, yada yada yada. But more importantly, we cut to a man walking through a blizzard that's going on outside and collapsing. After the children go to bed, the adults are talking about how rough this winter is going to be. The tides that normally bring the warm water have been weaker, and the stress is weighing on the family. The next morning, our main protagonist, who's the small child, hears family is working to shovel out snow from around their cabin, and Thorfinn's sister Ylva is complaining about how they don't have a slave. It's shown that Thorfinn's father, though, doesn't necessarily believe in using slaves. You're a good man! Ylva falls through the snow and actually discovers this collapsed man who is dying due to hypothermia. They usher him inside and try and warm him under some blankets near a fire, and he is in a terrible state. People can often wake up from extreme cold and seem like they're recovering and still die due to all kinds of awful things happening inside their body. So I kind of saw this guy definitely not making it coming. Thorfinn is still talking to this older man who has tales of the Americas, and after being told about how his ancestors ran from invaders in their original homeland, Thorfinn runs off, calling the old man a liar, saying that his family would never retreat, and he goes to see his father. But what he runs into, of course, is seeing this slave trying to be healed by his father. There is some real tension added when apparently a neighboring family arrives on his ship with a bunch of armed men, demanding to know where his escaped slave might be. The old man intercepts this party and is trying to distract them. Some of the younger warriors also show up, and the beef between these two clans begins to escalate. Swords are even drawn over old injuries before the leader of this group actually whips his chain around and puts it around one of his own soldier's face, dragging it to the floor after just talking about how chains are the only jewelry that actually look good on people. That's a villain entrance. Right there, villain entrance. Got it. During this, though, we're actually seeing cutaways to the escaped slave having visions as he dies. And here we see Thorfinn's father speaking to him of a place called Vinland, where it's peaceful and there's food and warmth. And it's clearly him recognizing this slave probably doesn't have too much longer, and he just wants to ease his passing into the beyond. And it's kind of a really beautiful moment, not only for setting up what exactly Vinland is going to represent for this story or be, but also characterization for the father. And here we see the neighbor has actually pushed his way into the father sitting over the slave. And despite his daughter trying to say, no, he was just trying to keep your slave alive. He's not hiding him from you or anything, please. When the invading neighbor makes it clear that their intention is to take the slave back and torture them in front of other slaves, set an example, Thorfinn's father actually offers an exuberant price, ending up at 8 sheeps just to be able to keep this man who he knows is most likely going to die. That is accepted by the neighbor, and they walk away with 8 sheeps after we know this family is already going to be struggling to keep themselves fed over winter. Ylva is not happy about this and says it was a stupid move. And then we see little baby Thorfinn asking his father, "Did we come here to escape too? Mr. Leaf says our ancestors came here from the east, that we came to Iceland to escape." His father responds, "Yes, that's what is said." "Then if someone wants to escape from here, where do they go?" And that goes unanswered as they watch Ylva put down the last rocks on the slave's grave. From here, we cut to what I imagine is at least a few days later, and we're watching the children play at battle. This is interrupted by Mr. Leaf coming forth and saying that he's leaving, to which of course Thorfinn's like, "Let me come with you on adventure." And Leaf's like, "No, I'm not going on an adventure. I'm going to do some trade to get some wine and stuff, cause Jesus." No, really, that's in there. It's because they're Christian. Christianity's a thing in Viking culture at this time. This is all interrupted though by a warship being spotted on the horizon. 2 different instances of a ship showing up bringing conflict. I imagine that's going to be consistent in Vinland Saga. It's Vikings. Makes sense. We see Thorfinn's father is working a forge, and he's apparently having a bit too strong of a hand at it. Cool little setup there for his character being strong as hell. But this is interrupted by Thorfinn running in and saying there's another warship on the horizon, bigger than the one before, and they've requested Thorfinn's father. Jom comes and meets the band, and they actually all bow to him as he walks out onto the pier. He says that he never thought these people, whoever they may be, would follow him all the way to Iceland, but after a sit-down with the commander of the arriving warship, it appears that Jom, Thorfinn's father, was a deserter. And despite his deserting status, all forces are being ordered to return for an invasion into England. And this section ends with, "Your participation is required in the coming battle." And yes, the words in these scans are different than my books again. Sorry for the inconsistencies for what's on screen. And the framing around Jom definitely has shifted to this moment where before he seemed really kind and like big, but like gentle. Now there's this shot of him that's just like, I love me a gentle giant who's a secret badass. Great character trope. Now I am going to do some more reading. And when you see me in about 3 seconds, time will have passed. Before we go any further, 2 things. 1, yes, I did shave to symbolize the fact that time has passed. And 2, I'm aware I was calling him Jom when it's the Jom Vikings or Jom's Vikings, and his actual name is Thors. My bad, not gonna do that anymore. Because he became my favorite character of Vinland Saga so far? That was a question for some reason. Let's go ahead and continue further on. I have so many feelings now. So Floki is sitting down with Thors and essentially telling him, look, we know you deserted, but if you agree to come back and fight with us, you will be returned in the legend status you had, and we will forget about your little discrepancies. Thors agrees to this and is like, all right, I'll come back for this war, just this one. And he hatches a little scheme where he's actually going to go to war with a small band from his village, but that band's actually going to be taken back and he's going to go alone because he's not letting a bunch of his people come with him to war because he's like, I'm all against war now. The typical jaded veteran who's a legend. I love it. Secret badasses. Always a win. And people in the village, though, when they hear this, they're freaking out. They're like, he was a legendary warrior. That's awesome. I get to fight on his side. This is gonna be great. Not realizing there are a bunch of inexperienced villagers who would likely get murdered. And especially Thorfinn is like, dude, my dad's a hero. And he starts playing war with his like friends and actually like beating the crap out of them and being all violent because he's obviously having a lot of like childlike emotions because he's realizing my dad's a war hero. That's great. Also, my dad's gonna abandon me. That's not great. And they have this epic scene where they're like unloading Thor's old ship, and it has like all the people who are going to go with him pulling it out of the place it's stored in. And in the inevitable film adaptation or series adaptation that's going to happen for Vinland Saga, this is going to be the moment where like the big epic swelling music comes in and we see like flashes of Thor's armoring up. That's how that scene is going to be shot and filmed for this adaptation whenever it occurs. But while they're preparing this ship for its journey, we see one of the boys that Thorfinn beat the ever-living piss out of is brought before Thor Thors, and he's like, yeah, that's a broken arm. My 6-year-old just broke the arm of a 12-year-old. That's not good. It's kind of cool, though. He doesn't say that. I say that. But a bunch of the local village men are like armoring up in their ancestors' armor and like saying like, oh, my ancestor cleaved a horse's head clean off with this thing. Isn't that cool? What's with manga and killing horses? I grew up riding them. Horses are awesome. Thorfinn, though, is going through like a chest and trying to find a weapon of his own, telling his sister, like, I don't need toys anymore. I'm an adult at 6. Give me a sword. And he finds like a little knife and he's like, ah, this is what I'll use. And of course, in another cliche moment, and don't take that as an insult, cliches are fine. Tropes can be great if they're done well. And so far in Vinland Saga, despite there being so many of them that's becoming slightly distracting, they're all being done well enough, or at least getting out of the way fast enough, that I'm not minding them much. But in a very cliche scene, we see Thors comes in right as Thorfinn grabs the dagger, takes the blade, and like holds it so hard he starts bleeding in his hand and says, "Who are you going to kill with this sword?" A rather intense question to ask a child. Thorfinn says, enemies. And he responds, and who is your enemy? And then his father grabs him very tightly by the shoulders and does that kind of dad thing where your dad kind of forgets like, hey, you're a kid and maybe can't take the emotional depth of whatever their traumatic past is, and starts like unloading the full level of trauma onto his child because he says, you have no enemies. No one has any enemies. There is no one that should hurt you. And there's blood seeping from his hand as he presses the dagger against his son. Thors, love you, dude? He's 6. That doesn't make sense. You're going off to battle tomorrow. You're going to kill enemies. Don't treat me like a child. Even I can tell when you're lying to me. And it's tragically ironic knowing that Thors is not lying to Thorfinn. What he's saying is absolutely true in a metaphorical, spiritual sense. In a literal, practical sense, yeah, he's wrong. And a child is only going to be able to process that and not the deeper meaning that Thors is trying to communicate to his son. So it's one of these great moments of failed communication that doesn't feel forced. This isn't one of those things where you're like, just explain it and you'll resolve the conflict. This is a character actually reasonably explaining something to their own trauma and emotional understanding, hoping that their son would understand, overestimating their child's ability to perceive them, but really wanting them to, and then the kid, to no fault of their own, being a child, not getting it. That is not forced failed communication. That is well-written failed communication. And like just showing how pathetic these warriors are compared to the ones they're going to be going up against. Their mothers and wives are giving them like prepared meals just to like give the imagery of like, these are village farm boys going off to play at war. They're going to encounter veterans. Thorfinn can't be found during this time, and it looks like Thors is just going to have to accept the fact that he's not going to finally be able to say goodbye to his son, but he says to his wife, tell Thorfinn that, well, and his wife says, I know. I'll tell him. For those moments, it's like cliche communication between husband and wife, but it's one of those things that's like, it's real. There's tons of moments where I like look at Kayla and I'm like, you know, because I'm an idiot and I'm a guy, I can't process my emotions right. And she's like, I got you. In a display of how Vinland Saga is going to be riding the line between realism and a little bit over the top like fantasy, we have 5 men on one side of the boat rowing and Thors alone on the other side with a gargantuan oar just rowing on his own, matching those 5 men. I'm not saying that's impossible, right? Like if you had 5 of me and then the mountain on the other side of a boat, it would even out. Like that's actually like fairly not fantastical. That's reasonable. The only thing I find fantastical is they had a gigantic fucking oar ready to go so that he could solo row on one side while everyone else is over there. It's not even fantastical. It's just like a play at humor. Maybe, okay, I'm sure there's gonna be some history nerd in the comment section who's like, actually, this was common practice when they had gargantuan steroided up Viking. But after they make it out to the current and no longer have to row, we hear someone respond to something Thors says with father, and everyone's like, father, and Thorfinn bursts out of a barrel, having snuck himself on board the ship. And in a moment of humor that didn't quite work for me, but made me go like, all right. He goes to the edge and immediately pees, because he's been in there for hours, I assume, and was about to soil himself. From here we cut to Floki's men, who, the traitor of Thors is Floki. Great name choice. And he is in a meeting with, would you guess it, Askeladd. And in this meeting, Floki essentially tells Askeladd, hey, go kill Thors for me, because he's actually just a deserter and we want him to die. But I can't kill him because that would be bad luck for everyone, so you go kill him and I'll pay you a lot of money. Askeladd is able to get more money out of the deal through a display where one of his men accidentally kills one of Floki's guards, and then he's able to get like upfront payment and quite a bit. And then later on, as he's leaving, he susses out with one of his men like, I think the reason isn't for like saving face. I think Floki's genuinely afraid of Thors, and that's why he's sending us. And you would be correct from what we're about to see. But I like the establishment we've already gotten, and this is a really good, speaking of the structure of this story so far, and how we're being introduced to the characters. We as readers know already from the siege we saw earlier, Askeladd's a son of a bitch, and is not going to play fair going up against Thors. And I think Floki probably even knows of his reputation, so he's just like, yeah, that's where I'm going to hire this guy. And for every author who's wondering, what's the appropriate use of flashbacks, flash forwards, time jumps, this is it. Establishing important character beats that make a reader feel something ominous is coming, provide an answer to a question that might not necessarily be the case, but builds in the back of their head, percolates. That's the appropriate usage of time jumping stuff like this. It's not to provide answers in the moment when you're like directly asking them. It's to plant seeds for things that will pay off or set up characteristics that are going to come into play. That's why you want to do it, at least in my subjective opinion. There's also kind of a funny juxtaposition where Askeladd is like, this Thors must be mighty indeed. And we see in that moment, Thors is spanking Thorfinn for coming and sneaking aboard the ship. That's a bad boy. We get a couple nice moments of characterization further endearing us to Thors that kind of shows what kind of jackass he was when he was off Vikinging around versus who he's become. And it's a little bit too blunt here. We're kind of verging into that, like, it's becoming so obvious you're about to kill this character with what you're doing territory that it's going to take away a bit from the death for me, but it's not like offensively bad. But if you've read a lot of stories like this before, you know Thors is going to die at this point. As I said, this is a spoiler read-through, so anyone who's mad that I'm spoiling that, I warned you at the beginning. And we get some really nice geographic placement within this world here, where we even see Thorfinn wakes up and he's like, are we at England? And Leif comes in with a map put in behind him in the panel showing like, no, we're actually at this location. And having that grounding and reminder that this is based off of like, you know, real environments, real people is pretty cool. I haven't had that in manga yet. But they come into this narrow pass with their ships, and Thors rightfully has like a bad feeling in his gut, noticing there's like less houses down there. And so as he starts trying to turn his ships around, the people who have disassembled the houses and brought them in the canyons above them push in the debris to block their way, and of course, it's Askeladd and his men and a bunch of archers, and two ships come around the bend up ahead to confront Thors and his men. And in the final really great execution of development of character for Thors for me, he so quickly and calmly takes command of the situation, realizes exactly what's going on, and gives his men the perfect orders to prepare, essentially saying, there's no surrender, they're just coming to kill us or sell us into slavery. Fight now or die. Because yeah, no one's gonna set up an ambush like this and then be like, you surrendered? Should have just said so. And we see Askeladd and a much superior force is approaching, so Thors opens a chest and begins suiting up with his sword, and even gives the small dagger that Thorfinn picked up before and is like, only use this to protect yourself. You're 6. So there's two ships coming at Thorfinn's crew though, and we see that the commander of the ship that Askeladd is not on is like, let me take him on my own. And he takes like a berserker mushroom, which is a real thing that Vikings did, and he prepares to go on and like try and take down Thors without having to get Askeladd involved. But before he can even properly approach Thor's ship, Thors jumps from his own ship and lands on this motherfucker's ship. Oh my god, that is such an alpha move to be like, okay, crew, hunker down, prepare for overwhelming odds. I'm gonna go jump on their ship. And then without drawing his weapon, beats every man on the ship. Doesn't kill them, just beats the piss out of them. Including the berserker. Berserker guy come for him, and Thors is just whop, whop, whop. Berserker gets back up, cause Berserker. That just brings more whop whop whops. Like, this dude is straight up bringing a Bruce Lee level strategy to a Viking fight. Just like even doing like the behind the head hit thing that is like very cliche for kung fu movies. If you're going to kill a character, badass last stands where they kill a ton of enemies, absolutely the way to go. While he was doing this though, Asklund took his own ship around to confront Thor's crew, and as they're about to board, they put the planks over, about to come to wipe out the inexperienced force. Thors takes the berserkered up second in command and throws him onto the planks, jumps back onto his own ship and is like, I just f***ed up half your guys, what's up? Specifically, he says, listen closely, your strength has already been halved. Leave this place now, and your lives will be spared. And Asklund's response is not fear, but he seems mildly aroused. Thors finishes it off though with, begone, pirates. You cannot defeat me.
It is driving me up the wall that my words don't match what's on screen. I'm sorry.
Now the archers from above are waiting for the sign from Asklund to just rain down death upon Thors and his crew, but he apparently hasn't given the sign yet, so they don't. And then Thors just picks out Asklund and says, you're their leader, I'm going to challenge you for a duel. If I win, you leave me and my people. If I lose, we'll all come peacefully. And Asklund's like, how'd you know it was me? How'd you know I was in charge? Which, dude, you're the guy in the breastplate. Like, yeah, you're in charge. You also have the goatee. Everyone knows the guy with the goatee's in charge. But they agree to have a duel, and Asklund tries to win it right away with a dirty trick, which, to his credit, Thors spots, counters, and gets a mild scratch from, but that's it. And from there, Asklund tries another dirty trick, breaking Thors' sword, but Thors was anticipating that and disarms him once he overcommits to a swing. Actually kind of reflecting how Asklund beat Thors' son, Thorfinn, at the beginning, which is really cool. I like that a lot. They just wait for an overcommitted attack. It's like he learned from his fight with Thors. And despite Thors having won the duel, Asklund's second in command jumps aboard the ship and takes Thorfinn hostage, basically saying, drop your sword, I got your kid. We don't really abide by the rules of duels. Sorry. Thors puts his sword to Asklund's throat in response to this and says, you lost. And then Asklund's like, I did lose. I'll admit that. I lost. Totally lost. Still here to kill you though. We'll let your people go. And that's the victory Thors is allowed, which is really sad, but he does throw his sword away and say, okay, I lost, kill me, leave my crew and son. And Asklund, to his like 1/1/8 of a credit, seems to agree to this. And at that point, the archers are signaled and Thors is riddled with arrows. But in the badass of badass moments, he doesn't even take a knee. Motherfucker stands on his feet and continues giving orders and talking to people.
Yes, keep shooting. Yep, keep shooting. What kind of arrows are you using?
He makes sure Asklund is going to withdraw his troops and not harm his men. Terrifying. I imagine Asklund is pissing his pants at this point as this guy with like a dozen arrows in him is like, you're gonna keep your word, right? I will come back as a And then he tells Leif to bring his head to the chieftain of Jom and tell him he was slain by pirates. That way the chieftain will know he's not just deserting again, he'll have the proof of his head and not take out his possible desertion on his village. And finally, once his son is let go, he says a final goodbye and dies. And after one of Thor's men tries to attack Asklund, Asklund easily puts him down and says, you stupid little today should have taught you the value of your own life. Give thanks to Thors. His death is worth more than 100 green boys like you. And like, I really love when an author takes a moment to be like, this guy's a son of a bitch. He is the antagonist. He's bad. He's got some character to him, though. And the fact that Asklund says this makes me be like, I hate you. You're the worst. You're right, though. And here we see Thorfinn in the hull of the ship hiding away, grieving his father's death, not understanding why his father won but still died, why he threw away his sword. It's obviously very confusing for him and setting up the Thorfinn we met at the beginning of this volume. And finally we see Asklund is woken up and they see Thorfinn is actually still on the boat they took from Thors and his crew, because remember they had two boats, one went back to the village, and Thorfinn is still on there just staring death over at Asklund like, I'm gonna kill you! So just imagine like you're walking to the back of your boat and you see silhouetted in the night a child with a knife like, you're gonna die! Low-key, definitely terrifying. And with that pledge of killing Asklund Sunday, Volume 1 has come full circle, tied up so many things very cleanly in terms of characterization, world building, plot stuff, like so much of this world makes sense just in this one contained volume. Super duper cliche, to the point where it did become slightly bothersome, executed well enough that I still absolutely enjoyed it. It's still too early for me to give any kind of solid rating for Vinland Saga, but what I will say just from this first volume alone, this is probably going to be my go-to recommendation manga for friends of mine who are very hesitant to get into it. This is a phenomenal entry point for the medium because it has a really nice balance of utilizing some of the things you're going to see commonly in manga, but also stretching the medium to fully utilizing its forms in a lot of ways. The art style isn't my favorite ever, but definitely interesting enough to make people appreciate that angle of what manga is. It's not over the top with a lot of its humor that can be off-putting for people, and it's certainly grounded enough that almost anyone I know will feel immersed in this story because of how much it's going to feel familiar to other Viking or European-esque stories they're probably used to. Of course, I'm speaking as someone who's going to be recommending this to my friends who are Americans, those who are international, probably a different story. And if I had to put a number this early onto the story, this is a solid 7.5. And know that I'm always hesitant to give really high scores to stuff early on. That's impressive and can really only go up if what goes after it is even stronger. It really can't go any lower though, because well done. I could even see this as being like if you're willing to have the unsatisfaction of how exactly Thorfinn will eventually get his revenge, a cool standalone story that people could just read on its own. But that has just been our first read through of Vinland Saga. Do not expect these too often because they are a lot of work. As you can see, it's the first time I've ever had to like 1-2 a recording ever here on the channel. So like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of it, and share it if you'd like this series to blow up and me to be motivated to put these out more often. I got books.